in your eyes, where is this war-like situation, Israel-Iran, going?
To some extent, it's a religious issue. It's about Muslims versus Jews, and they are trying to create this pan-Turan corridor, which will essentially wipe out the nation of Armenia and create a whole Turkic corridor.
This Iran thing came up. The Gaza-Israel thing is already going on. What do you think the mood is like in that nation?
Gaza has been sealed off. Palestinians obviously want Israel to cease to exist. But long term, there is this deep hatred, which is like a blood hatred.
What's been India's stand on both these conflicts?
India's borders are likely to change in some way. In which direction, I would not like to talk about it.
He said it already. What's happening on a global scale?
Europe is in recession. People are worried in Europe that Putin may have expansionist ambitions and would want to take Poland, Hungary. There's a Cold War happening in Africa as well.
Drone warfare is now an out-and-out reality. It's gone from being something theoretical 5 years ago to being a reality now.
A whole new level of warfare is coming up. People imagine China is the second most powerful nation. They simply are a powerful economy. But look at how many nuclear weapons they have. This much. Look at how many nuclear weapons the Russians have. They have enough nuclear weapons to annihilate the world. If they want, they can squash China tomorrow.
Abhijit Chavda is back for a geopolitics special. Here we go. Abhijit Chavda is back. You're the only guest who's been a part of almost all our studios, barring the first ever one. But that's a testament to your knowledge and how many podcasts are buried inside you. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you so much. Great to be back. Always great to be back on TRS.
No, always great to host you here. This has now become an extension of the conversations we have anyway.
Yes.
But when it comes to these geopolitical conversations, I think people really enjoy the flavor of this combination that we have. So should we just deep dive straight in?
Let's do it, yeah.
Okay. People watch these episodes of TRS from an educational perspective, but also from a perspective of knowing the future a little bit. Should we begin with Israel-Palestine or should we begin with Israel-Iran?
Let's begin with the Middle East. And there's a whole lot going over there. A lot to unpack. So the current crisis, the Middle East is always in crisis. If you look at the past 70, 80 years of history, the Middle East is always in crisis. But the current crisis begins somewhere around, what was the date? October 7, when Hamas launched this massive strike on Israel, this massive terrorist attack on Israel. They cut the wires which cut off Gaza from the rest of Israel, and they broke through and they massacred more than 1,000 Israeli civilians, which is clearly a terrorist attack. It's a human rights atrocity and whatever you want to call it. And Israel was clearly caught off guard by what happened. They had no idea this was going to happen. Big intelligence failure, human intelligence, signals intelligence, whatever other kind of intelligence, huge failure from Israel's perspective. And this was almost exactly on the 50th anniversary of the previous biggest failure in Israel's intelligence history, which is the Yom Kippur War. So this happens. Israel is caught off guard. They do not send in reinforcements quickly enough, and this massacre ensues. And then Israel gets its act together and launches this massive military attack on the Hamas positions in Gaza. And people are saying it's a humanitarian crisis, which it is because civilians are being affected. But when you do such a thing, a terrorist attack of that magnitude, you're going to have something coming back to you. So that's the situation that we have now. That is the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war, which is still continuing. And Gaza has been, to a significant extent, been devastated. People have died. Israel tried to implement what we call a two-state solution in the year 2005, when they made Gaza separate and gave the people of Gaza their own government. They could elect whoever they want, and the people of Gaza they decided to vote for Hamas. And Hamas is an out-and-out anti-Israel organization, and they've been building tunnels, and they've been stockpiling arms and ammunition and thousands of rockets and all that. So that's where all of this has brought us to. So that is the war. Now, even Hezbollah has been involved. Hezbollah is based out of southern Lebanon, which is a nation to the north of Israel. So Israel's northern border is kind of warm. It's not exactly hot right now, but there is some exchange of fire and all going on a reasonably regular basis. So in the north of Israel, you have this involvement of Hezbollah, and Hamas and Hezbollah are both said to be proxies of Iran. Now, Iran is the other big power in the Middle East, in the West Asia region. It is an ancient nation, an ancient civilization, and since 1979, it's been very strongly anti-Israel, anti-US. 1979, you had the Islamic Revolution that happened in Iran. Iran became a theocratic nation. The Islamic Republic of Iran was formed after 79, and the political elite of Israel of Iran, the political class, they are of the opinion that Israel has no right to exist. And when you have that attitude, obviously they're going to have a very hostile relationship with that nation. And the US is also, because of the events of 79, very strongly anti-Iran, because they took these American diplomats hostage for a very long period of time, and they stormed the embassy and all that. Old history.
At its core, is this a religious issue between Iran and Israel?
I don't think it's a religious issue. It's about... well, to some extent, it's a religious issue because it's about Muslims versus Jews, and the support that Iran as a Muslim nation has for the Palestinians who are also Muslims against what they call is a Jewish oppression and all that. But beyond that, that's the first level that we can look at. Beyond that, below that, there is the power projection angle. Iran is a geopolitically ambitious nation. They have these rich reserves of energy which can make that nation very prosperous, but they have been under very strong US sanctions for a very long time, which has devastated the nation to a significant extent. But they still have this memory of being a great empire, the Persian Empire, and they would very much like to have that again. And there are other states or nations in the neighborhood that are kind of anti them. Saudi Arabia has been a US ally for a very long time. The UAE is also a US ally. Iraq used to be a US ally during the time of Saddam Hussein, and there was this proxy war, the Iran-Iraq conflict in the 1980s. So Iran is a nation that feels like it's surrounded by enemies, but they also have these proxies far afield, far beyond their borders. Hezbollah, Hamas, they have the Houthis in Yemen. They have lots of, let's say, proxies once again in the nation of Iraq. Once again, that could be because of the religious angle, because Iraq is more than 50% Shia, and so on. So Iran is playing this game. They want to project power beyond their borders. They would like to re-establish maybe the Iranian Empire, the Persian Empire. And they are also in the process of developing a nuclear deterrent. So the Americans and other nations had come to this agreement with Iran. It was called the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, within which the Iranian nuclear program would be capped, and it would be only used for civilian purposes. But Mr. Donald Trump walked out of it unilaterally in 2017 or 2018. The viewers can check out the date. After that, Iran has been free to once again start enriching uranium hexafluoride through its centrifuges and creating more uranium, enriched highly weapons-grade uranium, more than 90% pure uranium that you can use in nuclear weapons. So Iran, as of today, may probably have sufficient nuclear fissile material, to perhaps construct a few rudimentary nuclear bombs. And that is something that worries Israel a lot, because Israel also is a nuclear weapons power, an unstated nuclear weapons power, but it's believed to have about, let's say, 90 or 100 nuclear warheads. So there is all these dynamics happening in the region. There's also the Turkish angle. North of Iran, you have the nation of Azerbaijan, which is a very strong Turkish ally or proxy. And they are trying to create this pan-Turan corridor, which will essentially wipe out the nation of Armenia and create a whole Turkic corridor from Turkey in the west all the way to Turkmenistan and other Turkic nations in the east, Central Asia region, which is something that Iran would not like to see happen. Even the Americans would not like to see this happen. Even the Russians don't want this. So there's a whole lot going on. The Middle East is always a very complicated region, but you have that. And then what happens on April 1 this year is Israel allegedly launches an airstrike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, the capital of Syria. Now, Syria has been under siege for the past decade and a half. The Americans tried to effect regime change. They tried to remove Mr. al-Assad from power, but the Russians stepped in, Mr. Putin stepped in and ensured that this government does not fall out of power. And Syria it's kind of a fragmented nation. If you go to the far east of Syria, there are a couple of US military bases on Syrian territory. So the whole of the nation is not under the government's control. But Syria also is let's say, a Russian proxy, and there's Iranian involvement there as well. So Russia, Iran, and to some extent China are working together in the Middle East region to offset the US allies in the region. So there's a Cold War kind of process happening, which kind of sometimes spills out into hot warfare. So the Israelis bombed the Iranian consulate in Syria, which is clearly a violation from any perspective of international law. Now the Iranians were put in this conundrum. What do you do? If you don't respond, you lose all credibility, and your allies will be afraid to trust you after that. So they had to respond. So then later this month, in April, I don't remember which date, 13, 14, something like that, the Iranians launched a massive strike on Israel. A whole bunch of drones were first launched. Then they launched cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. But it was done in such a way, it was choreographed in such a way that all these assets will arrive in Israel at the same time. So first you have to launch the slow-moving offensive weapons, which are the drones. Now those become very clearly visible on radar and all that. So the Israelis knew this is coming. And then they were able to take out most of this. So the Jordanian government got involved. They took out some of the missiles and drones. The Saudis got involved. They also took out some of the missiles and drones. And the rest of these missiles and drones were neutralized by the Israeli Iron Dome system. And some of the missiles, etc., they did impact some targets in Israel. Overall, not a lot of damage, but a massive number of assets were deployed against Israel. So this had a couple of effects. First of all, it did not do a lot of damage in Israel. It was choreographed in such a way that the Israelis could see it coming. But the Iranians got to see exactly which nations act in which manner and what are the kind of defenses they have. And once again, the Iranians did not have to spend a lot of their stockpile. It was just a fraction of what they have in reserve. So that's what happens. Then the Israelis, obviously, they are now in a position that if we don't retaliate, we will lose face, we will lose credibility. So they also launched a retaliatory airstrike on certain Iranian targets a few days later. Some military assets were kind of damaged or destroyed, but overall the Iranians have claimed that there's been no significant damage and the situation seems to have calmed down right now. The main problem is that the two nations, it's very hard for them to go to war because the borders of the two nations are about 1,000 kilometers apart. And the major cities are about 2,000 kilometers apart. So how do you fight a war? Unless you get the US involved. The US has military bases in the region, south of Iran, across the Persian Gulf and all that. But we don't want a war there because a significant amount of the world's energy flows out of the Persian Gulf. And if Iran is in a state of war and they are a reasonably capable military power, they have very good drones and whatnot, then they are in a position to close off the Persian Gulf via the Strait of Hormuz, and that would make oil prices globally shoot up, which will destroy the economies of some nations, and it will be overall bad for the global economy. So we don't want a war there. So that's where we are right now, vis-a-vis the Middle East region. The Houthis, the Ansar Allah faction in Yemen are also involved in targeting various Israeli ships and all that. There are Somali pirates involved in the Western Indian Ocean region. The Indian Navy is currently conducting freedom of navigation operations in this region, especially vis-a-vis the Somalian pirates, so that there is a reasonable amount of navigation and the overall economic order is not affected too badly. So that is the situation right now. The Middle East is more tense than normal. Now the two nations won't go to war. It doesn't look like that, but there's gonna be, let's say, asymmetric warfare between the two nations, which means proxies will be involved in some way. The Mossad could carry out assassinations of various hypothetically could carry out assassinations of various Iranian targets within Iran. The Iranians could use their proxies in various nations to attack Israel in various ways. There could be cyber warfare and whatnot. So the situation is not normal. It's way more tense than normal, but hopefully we won't have a hot war. That's where we are vis-a-vis the Middle East, the West Asia region.
Really, where do we go with this conversation though? Let's
talk about something else. Maldives. There's so much happening right now. Look, there's Maldives, which is acting up against India. There is that. There's always the India-China issue, the India-Pakistan issue. China and Russia, things are not entirely well between them. There is Ukraine that's happening, the Ukraine war. It's still going on. Europe is in recession. Things are not good for the European economy. People are worried in Europe that Putin may have expansionist ambitions and would want to take Poland, Hungary much more next. There are people who are fear-mongering about that. There is East Asia, which is Japan, South Korea, North Korea, Russia, and China. There's the Taiwan angle. There's so much that's happening. There's a Cold War happening in Africa as well.
Okay, let's come back to Iran and Israel.
Okay.
Because this was good context about what's happening on a global scale. But while you were talking about Iran, you said that they have geopolitical ambitions.
Yes.
In today's day and age, what does geopolitical ambitions mean other than expansion of land and or expansion of bank accounts?
Yeah. So geopolitical ambitions means that you want to have more power projection in a variety of ways beyond your borders. Iran, obviously, I mean, at the end of the day, you want your borders also to change and you want to grab more territory. If you look at historical Persia, it was much greater than what it is today.
Where did it spread?
The Caucasus region used to be under Persian control. The whole of present-day Turkey was once under the control of the Persian Empire. Okay. Alexander, once he started expanding eastwards, 2,500, almost 2,300 years ago, he went into Persian-held territory, which is current present-day Turkey. So the Persian Empire extended all the way to Turkey and Central Asia, parts of Central Asia, the Caucasus region. So obviously, at some level in your mind, you will feel that these are our lost territories, and at some point in the future, you may harbor hopes of getting those back again. And the people of the Caucasus region, they are kind of, you could say, they practice what you could call Iranian culture. The languages are like the Ossetian language, Ossetic language, are Scythian languages, Scythian derived languages, which are considered to be Iranic languages and all. So you have all that there.
Akhand Iran.
Akhand Iran. Yes, sir. Akhand Iran. Turkey wants Akhand Turkey. There's a whole lot happening in the region, you know? So Iran is geopolitically ambitious. Even though right now the borders may not be in a position to change, they want to be able to influence events beyond their borders. In nations like Iraq, for example, they would like the US to leave Iraq. They would like to have a pro-Iran government in Iraq, obviously a Shia regime. They would like to see Saudi influence reduce in the region, American influence reduce in the region, more Iranian influence, which means the entire neighborhood becomes more favorable for Iran. And then let's see how it goes in the future. So that's what I mean by geopolitically ambitious and geopolitically active. I mean, India, look at India, gigantic nation, subcontinent-sized nation, but our neighbors, see how they behave against India. They are all trying to bite back at India, whether it is Nepal who is using the China factor or Maldives who is using the China factor or whatever. In the case of Iran, it's different. Iran has active assets within Iraq, within Yemen, even as far as Gaza, as far as Lebanon, even in Syria. So they are active way beyond their borders, the way we are not. So a much more geopolitically ambitious and active nation compared to a nation like India, which has, in the past 10 years, India has changed, but before that, it was like a soft state. Anybody could come and punch us and we will just turn the other cheek. Iran is not that sort of nation. That's what I mean by geopolitically active and ambitious.
Do you think we'll ever see an expansionist India in our lifetimes?
In our lifetimes, it may happen.
Really?
It may happen in our lifetimes. It's possible.
I'm obviously asking you this question based on the fact that we've done countless geopolitical episodes together. And the one core learning I've had about geopolitics from you is that geopolitics unfolds over decades. So you can kind of roughly predict what is likely to happen. So two questions. One, I'll come back to this question about India being an expansionist country. Do you see us going in that direction? And two, whatever's happening with Iran, Israel now, did you think that this is what is going to unfold in the Middle East? Like, what was the version of this in your head before this Iran-Israel thing happened?
It happened completely unexpectedly. See, I look at probabilities. I don't try to make predictions. So right now, what's the probability of a conflict in this region? I look at it based on the balance of power of various nations. I have constructed what I call, it's not released yet, but by the time this episode comes out, it may be released. It's called the Chavda Index of hard power. So every nation, you can actually construct a hard power score based on a number of factors. So the US, in my index, it's the first Indian index of geopolitical power. Okay, in this index, the US gets about 94 out of whatever score it is. The next most powerful nation is Russia, which is above 50. Then you have China, which is around 15. And then India is fourth at 4.9. So the top four nations are the US, the sole superpower. Second is Russia, which is the near superpower. Third is China, which is like far below Russia, a great power. And you have a regional power like India. So every geographical region, let's say the West Asia region, you know what is the hard power score of each nation. And then it tells you what is the balance of power. And power is a weird thing. It exerts pressure outwards. The larger your hard power score, the more pressure you can expand, you can exert outside and beyond your borders. It's like a physical force. So in Asia, if you look at the balance of power, you have Russia, the most powerful nation, which is a Eurasian nation. Then you have China, and then you have India, these nations, and there is a whole balance of power based on which nations are competing against whom. So based on that, if you look at West Asia, you have Iraq, which no longer is hard power because the US took it over after the invasion, last invasion. And you have two major powers in the West Asia region, which is Israel and Iran. Now, if you look at that, they are reasonably well balanced. So something happened and somebody made a plan that we're going to kind of try to offset or upset the balance of power. And that's how this Hamas war happened. It's not something that I had ever predicted. It is not something I had expected, but it happened and it caught everybody off guard. So it is not something that I had expected would happen. But yeah, that's a kind of volatile region where anything can happen anytime. And there are certain flashpoints in the world which you have to keep a close eye on. The West Asia region is a flashpoint. It's always a flashpoint. India-Pakistan, a flashpoint. India-China is a flashpoint. South China Sea, Taiwan, it's a flashpoint. And East Asia, North Korea, South Korea, that's a flashpoint. And you have a flashpoint in Europe as well, the Ukraine conflict and whatever is happening over there. So these are the major flashpoints. I'm sure I have not missed anything out there. So things can go wrong in these places. Somebody miscalculates, somebody does something stupid, or somebody does something unexpected, and you can have a whole chain reaction that comes out of it. So yeah, so I had not expected that the Hamas war will suddenly start October 7. It is something that came out of the blue. When it comes to India's potential future expansionism, I say it could happen within our lifetimes, the next 20 to 30 years or whatever, because power is a force that pushes outwards. And India is a rising power. India is currently a middle power. It is not comparable to China. China is about 3 to 4 times more powerful overall than India. But China's hard power is not rising. It is stagnant and it's going to slowly start shrinking over time because of the impending and ongoing accelerating demographic disaster in China, which is the horrifically low total fertility rate, 1.09. To have a sustainable population at the level it is, you need a TFR, total fertility rate, of 2.1. When you go below that, what happens is that your population not only starts shrinking, the average age, the median age of your population starts rising. China's average age is about 39 right now. By 2050, it will be in the late 40s, 48 or so. By 2100, the average age will be 68, 69 in China. And the population will be half of what it is today. Long-term, China is doomed. Okay, from that perspective, who's going to fight the wars at the borders if the average person is 68, 69 years old? Even in 2050, the average person will be almost 50 years old. Who's going to fight? And China is such a weird nation where I must have said this before, every individual who lives in China, most of them, they have no brothers or sisters, they have no cousins, they have no uncles, they have no aunts. They are the last of a very ancient lineage. And you have a guy like that on the border and you expect him to die, his entire bloodline will die with him. You think they're going to be motivated to fight? Okay, they will obey the orders to go and fight and die if they are told to, but the motivation is going to be less compared to somebody who's defending their homeland like Indians. So yeah, so that's a deal with China. India, on the other hand, is rising. Its hard power is rising, economic power is rising. When your economic power rises and grows, your military power also rises. India's power projection abilities are visible. We are doing freedom of navigation operations in the Indian Ocean region. The Chinese Navy, even though it's so massive, they're building warships like sausages. They are constrained by the 2 island chains. The Americans have ring-fenced the Chinese Navy through these island chains. So China, overall, its power projection and its overall hard power is slowly shrinking now. It's beginning to shrink. It's still going to be a very powerful nation until the 2050s. But overall, it's shrinking. India, on the other hand, is rising. It's growing. The hard power score is rising. Every year it's going to rise to a certain extent, to a certain amount. So once you have that happening, borders change. Borders are never set in stone. And as your hard power index is rising, your score is rising, borders will change and expand outwards, not inwards. So that's why I say that in our lifetime, India's borders are likely to change in some way. And India's overall net area will increase, most likely. In which direction, I would not like to talk about it because it is not nice to say, but it will eventually happen.
You said it already.
I think those who can understand can understand.
Northwest. That's all I'll say. That direction. Where do we... Okay. A bunch of things to unpack. Why did you say 2050s for China? Like that, you're saying that based on the demographic
Demographic
predictions.
Yes.
Okay, my question is about the two ongoing war-like situations we see. One in Israel and Gaza, and the second one, Ukraine and Russia.
Yes.
What have we learned about modern-day war from these two situations?
Oh, yes, a lot.
Because war also evolves. I'm sure there's been a cyber angle, but specifically what?
So, yeah, that's a great question. What can we learn about 21st century warfare from the conflicts we have seen thus far in the 2200s? So, I was recently, we spoke off screen that I was rereading stuff about the First and Second World Wars. And you kind of seeing something similar over here. When the First World War happened, a lot of technologies that had never been used before were all ruled out and used in warfare. We are seeing something similar right now. So let me talk about, first of all, a war that very few people have paid attention to. The first Armenia-Azerbaijan war that happened in, I think, the year 2020. The second Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh conflict, 2020. You saw the use for the first time of loitering munitions. These drones that fly around for 2-3 hours and then suddenly go and attack. And these are suicide munitions, which means the drone will kill itself. So it will go and hit a tank. When it comes to tanks are very heavily armored vehicles. The weak spot of any tank is the top. And these drones, they fly around for hours, and when these guys least expect, they will come and drop down like kamikaze bombers on top of the tank. And they take out tanks. And tanks have been taken out in such vast numbers in that conflict, the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, and now in the Ukraine conflict as well. So it's a whole new dimension of warfare. We are seeing these little weapons, these drones, these loitering drones, and even anti-personnel drones, which take out one person or two people. It's like a flying hand grenade. It will chase a soldier around, and once it is like near enough, it will explode. It will detonate. And it's just a small detonation, like a single hand grenade, but it can kill or maim 3 or 4 people at a given time. So we are seeing this very new kind of warfare. Autonomous weapon systems that think on their own, that don't always need inputs from the remote controlling person far away, and they can take decisions on their own. We are beginning to see the influence of AI in this, very, very rudimentary AI systems put on a chip on a drone, and this drone can go and kill whoever it wants to kill on its own sometimes. So we are seeing this happening. A whole new level of warfare is coming up. Tanks could become obsolete if sufficient number of drones are available. Drones are pretty cheap compared to tanks. A tank will be a few $1 million. A drone is what, $1,000, $2,000? When it comes to the drones that Iran launched against Israel, one of those drones may cost $1,000, $2,000. And the Iranian Iron Dome defense, anti-aircraft defense, anti-missile defense system, each missile costs in excess of $1 million. So to take out a $5,000, $10,000 drone, you have to use a missile that costs $1 million. It's not gonna work. You launch enough drones, the missiles, the economics just doesn't work.
And Iron Dome is basically a region where missiles can intercept flying objects, right?
Yeah, it's a system. It's not a region. It's a system that the Israelis have developed. It's a very sophisticated system in which you take out flying objects with missiles. Whether it's a ballistic missile that's incoming towards you, whether it's a cruise missile that's coming towards you, whether it's a fighter plane that's coming towards you, or whether it's a drone. This system is very sophisticated, and it can take out with very high accuracy these incoming threats. But each rocket that you are launching is very sophisticated, very expensive, costs more than $1 million. And if Iran launches 2,000 cheap drones, it's going to saturate the system. It's a numerical certainty. So you can always defeat a system like that. That's a problem.
What I fear is the possibility that the world of drones brings to the world of terrorism. Because these are relatively cost effective to make.
Yes.
Which effectively means that every country, if possible, will have to build some kind of an Iron Dome to guard themselves against drone warfare.
Yes.
So all in all, drone warfare is now an out and out reality. It's gone from being something theoretical 5 years ago to being a reality now.
Yes.
But it changes the dynamics of warfare.
Completely.
And I would also assume that Israel is once again leading the race when it comes to hardware.
I'm sure they are. They have a very sophisticated nation technologically. They are at the forefront of lots of technologies. Yeah.
What do you think people in Israel are feeling about all this? Now, this Iran thing came up. The Gaza-Israel thing is already going on. What do you think the mood is like in that nation?
I think the Israelis are a very resilient, very hardy people. They have always been under a state of siege. From the time Israel was formed in 1948, the first thing that happened was all of their neighbors attacked them. The first war. So they have always been under this state of siege, and they have done a tremendous amount of progress out of almost nothing. So everybody undergoes military training, compulsory military training, unless you have some health issue or whatever. But almost everybody goes through that. So they all have this warrior mindset, and I'm sure there is a significant amount of paranoia, let's say, or the feeling that everyone is out to get us in Israel. But it's not something that's new for Israel. They have gone through this multiple times in their past. They've had multiple wars, the Yom Kippur War, the 48 War, and other wars. There have been smaller conflicts also that can be classified as wars, and so on. So it's not something very new to them. But obviously, it must be for someone like you and me. It will be very strange to live in that sort of society where there's the constant threat of annihilation. That everyone's out to get us. All our neighbors, they don't like us. Right now, they may be behaving themselves, but at the end of the day, all of them want to kill us. So yeah, it's strange.
In your eyes, where is this Israel-Iran and or Israel-Palestine thing going?
I don't see what the solution is. Look, there have been multiple solutions that have been proposed. A 3-state solution, 2-state solution, whatever. The 2-state solution is Israel gives some territory exclusively for the Palestinians to live in, and you live separately, we live separately, we don't bother with your life, you don't bother with our life, and we go our separate ways. You have your territory, you govern yourself. So that has actually been implemented in 2005 when Gaza became self-governing, and the people of Gaza voted Hamas to power. And we know what happened after that. So the Israelis have tried a 2-state solution. And see what happened. October 7, 2023, a massive terrorist attack. And there are people in Gaza who were crossing the border every day and working in Israel. They had employment in Israel. They were working in various roles in various places. Some of them were working as, gardeners or whatever in various homes, cleaners. And they're the ones who gave intelligence to the terrorists as to what are the vulnerabilities in each of these homes, in each of these kibbutzim and all. So now that is gone. The trust, whatever little trust was there, has been annihilated, destroyed. Those people will never get employment in Israel again. Gaza has been sealed off. So what happens now? I am at a loss as to imagine what the long-term solution to this problem is. I don't know. I mean, the Palestinians obviously want Israel to cease to exist. Iran wants Israel to cease to exist. They say that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which means no Israel. The river that they're talking about is the Jordan River, which is the de facto border between Israel and the nation of Jordan. From there to the Mediterranean Sea, you have the small nation of Israel. From the river to the sea, if Palestine is free, it means there is no Israel left. So that is obviously a call for the erasure of a nation and the genocide of a people. Now, obviously, that is something that no civilized person would want anywhere in the world. So that's not a viable solution. But then the Palestinians said that the Israelis are oppressing us. Well, the Israelis gave them a separate nation essentially in Gaza. And the Israelis were no longer interfering in what was happening in Gaza. But the Palestinians were not okay with that. So I don't know. The Palestinians would like the complete destruction of Israel. The Israelis just want to, they also, they are not entirely all saints themselves. There is the West Bank region in which they have been settling people. Maybe they should not do that. Certainly they should not do that, and so on. So both sides have done something or the other wrong. The terrorist attack on October 7 was an unforgivable thing, which a crime against humanity. But the Palestinians would say that the Israelis have been committing crimes against humanity. I don't know. I am an outside or external observer. I don't have a horse in that race, but I am not able to see a solution beyond the annihilation of one nation or another, which nobody wants. So yeah, it's a situation. It's a problem that seems to have no solution.
Both want the annihilation of the other.
Kind of.
Both have wanted the annihilation of the other historically as well, but it's never ended.
Yeah. So what do you do about this?
Could we see an end?
the end would not be a very nice end, So I don't know. The only thing I can see which is viable is a continuation of the status quo. Gaza remains sealed off from Israel. No person from Gaza, no Palestinian is allowed into Israel. The West Bank, maybe Israel should completely withdraw, but then there's the question of Jerusalem, which is part of the West Bank and all that. So lots of very, very complicated issues over here that have to be fixed. Gaza can be simply sealed off and they can live their life the way they want. They can receive whatever supplies they want from the sea and that sort of thing. That's one reasonably simple solution. The West Bank is more complicated. Maybe Israel should stop settling people in the West Bank in regions where the Palestinians claim that it's their land. And also, I think both sides can make some efforts to diffuse the situation. But long term, there is this deep hatred, which is like a blood hatred. And I don't know what the solution to that is.
You said that basically the way the Iranian missile and drone strike was planned was simply to kind of test waters. It was like putting your foot in a pond and seeing, okay, how does Israel and its allies react to this situation? So you said that Jordan responded by helping Israel and
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about Jordan and Saudi Arabia?
Well, it means that these are both US allies, and Israel is the number one US ally in the region. So the Americans, see, when it comes to sovereignty, there are only 4 sovereign nations in the world, the way I see it. The US, China, Russia, and India. The other nations all have compromised sovereignty or pooled sovereignty. When it comes to the West Asia region, Israel, you can say, is a more or less sovereign nation to a large extent. But nations like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they have military bases on their soil, which are American bases. And when you have foreign soldiers, foreign troops on your soil, you're not really a sovereign nation. So these nations, to a large extent, are controlled by the US, and they will do what the Americans tell them to do. So if they are instructed to defend Israel against whatever incoming airstrike or whatever strike, they're going to do it. So that is something the Iranians were able to possibly predict and definitely discover, that the Jordanians and Saudi Arabians will aid Israel despite being Islamic nations, which are kind of, you would imagine, antithetical to the Jewish nation. But there you have it. That's what happened. And the Iranians also did not want to cause a lot of damage. They wanted to placate their public, their citizenry, that look, we took this strong action and we have destroyed so many targets. The Israelis said no, very little was destroyed, but the Iranian government can claim that we launched X number of assets and destroyed Y amount of assets on Israeli territory. So it was at the same time designed to impress their own domestic public, to demonstrate the Iranian capabilities to the rest of the world, especially to Israel and to the US, and also cause as little damage as possible in Israel. And the Israelis responded in a very similar manner. They wanted to demonstrate that we can launch strikes directly on Iranian soil from outside of Iran, but they also calibrated the strike in such a way that it doesn't cause too much damage. So they were both trying to diffuse the situation while saving face and not losing credibility.
Marketing gimmicks.
You could say.
Geopolitical marketing gimmicks.
You could say that.
Okay. Do you want to move on to Russia, Ukraine? Because this seems like a situation that's almost over. Is it unfolding?
It is still unfolding, and it's a very dangerous flashpoint actually. So what's happening? Let's talk about that. So what's happening in Ukraine? There's not been much news coming out of Ukraine for quite a while. Here is the current situation. Russia is in control of about between a fifth and a quarter of the nation of Ukraine. Okay, it's a fluid situation. The lines on the front lines are changing here and there, but overall Russia has taken control of roughly a fifth to a fourth of the nation of Ukraine. Their forces are in the ascendancy. It's what's called the classic long war situation, long war scenario, in which both sides have said they are there and they know it is going to go on as long as it takes. The Russians are very patient. They have the Ukrainian armed forces have been devastated. They have essentially lost much of their young men. Then they had to resort to pressing middle-aged guys, 50-year-old, 55-year-old guys into battle. And then they have been forced to even press pregnant women into battle. That's been caught on camera. such ladies surrendering to the Russians and that sort of thing. So Ukraine has been demographically devastated. The flower of youth has been destroyed, especially the men. That's where Ukraine is. So Ukraine is merely a proxy conflict. Ukraine is the cannon fodder that the West is using to hopefully try, from their perspective, to weaken Russia. It's not worked. Russia has gotten better as time has progressed, as they always do in historical conflict. Initially, they don't do very well. But then over time, they get better and better and better. The 1940s is a classic example of that. Initially, they were devastated by Operation Barbarossa, but then they started pushing back and they pushed all the way back to Berlin. So right now, Putin wants to wait this out. Okay, that's become very clear. If they want, they can flatten Ukraine tomorrow. They have enough firepower, air power and all that to completely flatten Ukraine tomorrow, but they don't want to do that. So eventually what's going to happen in Ukraine is going to be partitioned. Possibly along the Dnieper River, which flows through Kiev, or in whatever other way. Whenever it ends, this conflict, it may either be a frozen conflict or a negotiated settlement to the conflict, but it's going to end on Russia's terms. Now, here's the danger in Ukraine. Somebody gets the genius idea of putting NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. That's going to be a provocation that the Russians will not ignore, because Ukraine has been their red line. The Ukraine conflict started because NATO was pushing eastwards all the way inexorably towards Russia. And then Russia was faced with the prospect of having NATO forces and NATO nuclear weapons right on their border. And that's why the Ukraine conflict had to be triggered off by Putin. Starts with the Crimea conflict, Crimea war in 2014 was it? And then what happened in 2022. So Monsieur Macron, the French president, has been saying that we will send French forces to fight alongside the Ukrainian forces in Ukraine. Well, Mr. Putin is not going to just sit back and let that happen. So that's going to be a significant escalation if NATO forces have boots on the ground in Ukraine. Right now, it looks like they're already sending military personnel as so-called military advisors in Ukraine. So not in an official formal combat capability, but as advisors. That's how the Vietnam War started. Okay, if you go back to that period of time, the Americans were sending military personnel as so-called military advisors and political advisors to help the South Vietnam government against the North Vietnam government. The South was pro-US, the North was pro-China, and that's the deal. That's how the whole thing started. They seem to be doing something similar right now in Ukraine. So the next stage of escalation is, it's no longer Russia versus Ukraine, it's now Russia versus NATO. Now that again is not yet as bad a situation as you can imagine, because NATO is under NATO control, NATO command. It's not under US command. But if even that escalates further and you have Russia versus the US, well, now we're talking about World War III. What is World War III? People talk about World War III every day. From my perspective, World War III is when the top two powers come directly in. There is a direct confrontation between the top two powers, which is the US and Russia. People imagine China is the second most powerful nation. They simply are a powerful economy. But look at how many nuclear weapons they have. This much. Look at how many nuclear weapons the Russians have. They have enough nuclear weapons to annihilate the world. They have the world's largest nuclear arsenal. The Americans come second. So Russia is a very powerful defensive power. If they want, they can squash China tomorrow. If they want. They have that sort of firepower. The Chinese are nothing compared to Russia. Russia is far ahead of China in terms of hard power. So from my perspective, World War III means the US and Russia fight directly. And we don't want that to happen. And Ukraine is the one flashpoint in the world where you could have that happen. So that's why Ukraine, it may seem like nothing is happening there, but it's a very dangerous thing that's going on right now.
And what's been India's stand on both these conflicts? Because publicly, we do give a bit of a diplomatic stand. I'm also asking you the one layer deep geopolitical angle. Give both the public and the layer deep version.
Okay, so the public viewpoint and perspective and stand of India is that war is bad. This is not the time for war. Mr. Modi has been saying that since 2022, I believe. Even when the last time Mr. Putin came to India for the India-Russia annual summit, Mr. Modi said in public that this is not a time for war. So India's stand has been consistent in this matter, public stand, that any conflict that's going on right now, there needs to be a diplomatic solution to that. Please stop fighting. Go and sit across the table and negotiate a reasonable settlement, which is, both can accept that. So that applies to Israel versus Hamas. It also applies to Russia versus NATO in Ukraine. And maybe Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin or their intermediaries can come together, and maybe the NATO, whatever, and work it out, talk it out, find a diplomatic solution. That has been India's official and consistently official position. One layer deep, well, it would not be incorrect to say that India has to some extent benefited from the Ukraine conflict, because now Russia is our top supplier of energy, petroleum. And we were initially getting the petroleum at very, very discounted rates. Even now we are getting favorable rates, not above the overall global thing. So, and this conflict, the Ukraine conflict, has actually brought India higher in stature, because India is playing a significant role geopolitically, not just as a mediator, but also as a nation that Russia and the US are both wooing. So the Russians need India as a powerful, large nation like India. If India is friendly with Russia and maintains diplomatic relations and does not go along with the US sanctions on Russia, that's a significant pressure release valve for Russia. And India buying so much Russian oil also makes sure that Russia doesn't have to go entirely in the Chinese lap and become a Chinese vassal or Chinese puppet. So India is very important from Russia from that perspective. And China is the only major threat from Russia, apart from the US, because of the large shared border. So if India gets more powerful, then it's also good for Russia from that perspective. So India is now playing a very central role in geopolitics because of all these things. The Americans want India on their side, at least vis-a-vis China, if not vis-a-vis Russia. The Chinese are worried about India's rise and India becoming more and more pally with the US. So overall, these conflicts have actually brought more attention on India, and they have helped India rise to a significant top 4 position globally from the geopolitics perspective. And obviously, because of the rise of China and the threat of China, lots of nations have this China plus one policy, which means that, okay, we are manufacturing most of our stuff in China, but we need to have a plus one nation. And that nation, the only nation that can serve that role, is India. So you're going to have semiconductor chips manufactured in India. We're going to have all kinds of other stuff manufactured in India. India is the number one destination globally now for FDIs, foreign direct investment. So India is going to rise as a manufacturing power as long as we play our cards well. So India has benefited from the Ukraine conflict. Whether people realize it or not, it's not like we wanted to benefit from it. But when something happens, you've got to make the best of the cards you are dealt. And India has done that really well. When it comes to the Gaza conflict, it doesn't hurt India, it doesn't benefit India. It can hurt more than benefit India. Because if the conflict, there's a big conflagration in the West Asia region, then our near abroad region gets destabilized. It could affect the things, the goods and whatever else is flowing into India. India, whether we know it or not, depends on the sea a lot. We have this gigantic seaboard, and we are a maritime nation. So much of our imports, especially oil, energy, all that come in from the sea, and we don't want a disruption of all these supply chains. So if the West Asia region becomes really destabilized, it could actually hurt India. So that is our perspective on West Asia. From the Ukraine perspective, we have actually kind of benefited. That's the one level deep answer.
If we see a conflict scaling up in the Gulf, if this Israel-Iran thing actually scales up, first of all, do you think it will?
I hope not. It doesn't look like it will. It doesn't look right now that it will.
Could any other conflict scale up?
Yeah, so the answer to the question is, which are the most powerful nations in this region? You have Israel, the most powerful nation, despite being so small. Number 2 is, let's say, Iran. Number 3 is Saudi Arabia. And then there's always the specter of Turkey. Okay, the shadow of Turkey is always there. But Turkey is not that powerful a nation, but extremely ambitious. Mr. Erdogan would like to revive the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, he would like to do that. He would like to do that going eastwards this time instead of going westwards. The Ottoman Empire expanded westwards into Europe. The Neo-Ottoman Empire of Mr. Erdogan's dreams would like to expand eastwards and reconnect with the Turkic nations of Central Asia, the various stans. Uzbekistan, not Tajikistan, apart from Tajikistan, all the other nations are Turkic nations. Tajikistan is an Indo-Iranian nation, or they would say Iranic nation. So the Turks would like to reconnect all of this and wipe out Armenia from existence. So I think overall, if a major conflict erupts, potentially in the Middle East, it will definitely involve Israel. The Saudis don't want to fight Israel. The Saudis want peace with Israel. The Saudis want to focus on economic growth beyond petroleum. Okay, the UAE also wants peace in the region. They don't want war. They want growth and development, and they want their economy to rise further. So the Saudis and the UAE, they are so friendly with India for these reasons, because India is a benign power. It's a non-threatening power, and India is such a economy with such a huge potential that the Saudis and the UAE, the Emiratis can work with India in mutually beneficial ways, and both economies can rise. And we have the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Trade Corridor, which was supposed to connect India with Greece and Europe via the Middle East region, and the Saudis and the Emiratis were supposed to be involved. But the Gaza conflict has kind of postponed the construction of this thing. So if a major conflict erupts, it's going to definitely involve Israel. The Saudis would not want to fight Israel. The Emiratis would not want to fight Israel. The Egyptians also would not want to fight Israel, because they're in no position to fight Israel because their economy is not doing well. So who's left? It's either Iran or Turkey. So that's what could happen if something does happen in the Middle East. It's either Israel, Iran, Israel, Turkey, or some combination of these factors.
Okay.
Or maybe the US does something stupid in the region, because the US has a lot of control in the region. They have lots of military bases in the region. They wanted to take down the Syrian government. This has not happened because of Mr. Putin. And they have a very old grudge to settle with Iran as well. So the Americans, if they do something very bright in the region, that could set off something. But hopefully it doesn't happen.
Is one able to predict America's moves, geopolitically speaking, post-World War II?
Post-World War II, the moves were very predictable. It was all predicated on containing Russia, on containing the USSR. And they were able to do it spectacularly well. Why did the USSR ultimately collapse? It's because of the pressure built by the Americans, who controlled all the sea routes, all the trade routes, all the supply chains. The USSR controlled only the Eastern European nations, the Warsaw Pact nations, and even the Chinese were on the US side eventually. And they had no access to the warm waters of the world ocean, and they were cut off from the global supply chains. So the only thing that they had was their own nation, which is an autarky. Everything they can imagine, all the resources they can imagine are available in their own nation, because it's such a vast landmass. But they were not able to project power anywhere. Let's say they wanted to project power in the South China Sea, they could not do it. Project power in the Indian Ocean region, they could do so to a certain extent, but not much. 71 was the last time they projected power. And that's why India was able to bifurcate Pakistan and give rise to Bangladesh, because of Russian actions that offset the US bullying of India. The Americans and the British had sent aircraft carrier strike groups in the Bay of Bengal to bully India, and to allow the Pakistanis to continue the genocide of Bengali Hindus in East Pakistan. But the Russians sent a nuclear submarine fleet to face off against the British and the Americans, and that's why India was able to liberate Bangladesh. There is 71. What happens in 73? The US takes possession of Diego Garcia. If you look at the Lakshadweep and Maldives Islands, Maldives on the north, you have the Lakshadweep Islands. A continuation of the same island chain is the Maldives, and it culminates in the south with the Chagos Islands, which are illegally controlled by the British, and they have given the island of Diego Garcia to the Americans, where the Americans have a major Air Force base, naval base, and a very sophisticated network of radars. So they took control of possession of this, the Americans, in 1973, as a response to the debacle of 1971, where they could not bully India into letting the Pakistanis continue their genocide. So that is the situation right now. So the Americans, their activities could be very easily understood during the Cold War era in the 20th century. It was all about the competition with Russia, with the USSR, and other nations that were friendly with the USSR, like India. So India was in the American bad books. That's why they supported Pakistan so much. The Americans financed and funded Pakistani terrorism against Afghanistan and India for more than 2 decades, until at least 2008, when the Mumbai attacks happened. After that, maybe it has gone below the surface to some extent. But that's the deal. In the 21st century, the American actions are kind of more complicated. On the one hand, the nation they really fear is Russia. But the nation against which they seemingly do their moves is China. So they would like to use India as a counterbalance to China. But India itself is a rising power. In 20 years, India could be the next China. So they use nations like Pakistan as a counterbalance to India. So that's why Pakistan is so important again in the US eyes and even in the Chinese eyes. So there is all these multiple layers of competition and geopolitics happening. The main threat for the US is Russia. People think it's China, but it's Russia. Russia is the real hard power that the Americans fear. And obviously, there's this competition and collaboration with China. The American economy and the Chinese economy are joined at the hip, actually. The Chinese have bought incredible amounts of US Treasury bonds. So they own a lot of US debt. And that means that the Americans eventually will have to repay that debt. And if they don't repay the debt, it means the US dollar is finished. The US dollar. And if the US dollar is finished, it means the US is finished. Because that's all the US have. The US superpower status is predicated on two things. First, their control of the global economy, which is entirely based more or less on the US dollar being the reserve currency, global reserve currency. And secondly, the power projection ability, because they have more than 800 military bases, American military bases beyond American territory, spread across the world. These two factors have made the US the superpower. If the US dollar collapses, how will they sustain those 800 military bases and so on and so forth? So the US and China are joined at the hip. The Chinese owe a significant amount of US debt. The Americans someday will have to pay it, or they'll have to decide that they are no longer a superpower or not. So that's where we are. It's very complicated in the 21st century, much more complicated. Of course, we have the benefit of hindsight to see the Cold War of the 20th century. We understand it very well. Similar things are happening right now, but it's no longer a bipolar world. The 20th century was a bipolar conflict, the US versus the USSR after the Second World War. Today, you have a multipolar world. You have one single superpower. You have a near superpower, which is Russia. You have a declining great power, which is China. And you have a rising middle power, which is India. And then you have nations like France and Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia, etc., Indonesia in the mix, which are kind of below the middle power status, but which are going to rise if they do things properly.
Almost at the end of this pacey geopolitical podcast, sir. But is there anything else you'd like to cover about just what's happening in the world right now? Because we're doing a podcast like this every 3 months now.
Mm-hmm.
So Myanmar, is that something you'd want to talk about?
Myanmar is a conflict no one talks about. And it's a very important conflict. And it's something that affects India directly. And it affects India very badly. So yeah, let's talk about Myanmar. Myanmar is Burma. It used to be a part of the British Raj. It's a nation that's culturally very close to India. They are Buddhists. They were Hindus in the past. These nations, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, all were part of extended India, which some would call Akhand Bharat. Very, very Indian in culture. But of course, ethnically, very, very diverse. So Myanmar, in 1935, they voted, the government of Myanmar, which was a puppet government of the British, in 1935 they voted to remain a part of British India. But the British forcibly cut Myanmar off from India. So Burma wanted to be part of India. They wanted to continue being a part of India. But the British cut that off. Now, today, you have a military government in Burma. It's been in power essentially since the 1940s when the British left the place. And it is not in control of the whole country. Myanmar, in the northern parts of Myanmar, you have all these different ethnic groups that are non-Burmese ethnic groups. They don't speak the Burmese language. They don't practice Burmese culture. Some of these ethnic groups, like the Kukis, who are called the Kukis, they are converted to Christianity in recent times, past 100 or so years. They speak a language that is native to Yunnan in China. And they are essentially outsiders who are now control Burmese territory, and they're fighting the Burmese government. So there is a civil war kind of situation happening there. And that is spilling over into India. So the state that everyone talks about because of what happened in the past year is Manipur. Manipur, the situation, I mean, it's a geopolitical situation which people seem to think is a law and order issue. In the 1980s and 90s, the Americans used to say Jammu and Kashmir is an Indian law and order issue. You people are not able to maintain law and order. And that's why you have this thing happening. When they were funneling Pakistani terrorists and arms and ammunition and weapons and money into Jammu and Kashmir to undermine the Indian government's control over its own territory. The Americans were doing that. Right now, It looks like Manipur is a law and order issue. It's again a geopolitical issue. And it's these terrorists, these outsiders, these infiltrators who are being funneled into India, into Manipur, from across the border in Burma, where the Burmese government has lost control. And you have the presence of various Western missionaries and various other things, and Chinese arms and ammunition and weapons coming in. So there is a drug angle, there is a poppy angle. The entire funding comes from selling drugs. Much of that was happening in Manipur as well until the government cracked down on it. Some of it may still be happening. And all the weapons that are coming in from China, arms, ammunition, because China, the Chinese border, the Yunnan border is about 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers away. It's not really far. It's very wooded and hilly region. And all these weird, disparate ethnic groups live here. And Manipur lost control of its destiny in the early 19th century when the Burmese conquered Manipur, the actual Burmese kingdom. The Burmese Empire conquered Manipur. It was 7 years of devastation of Manipur, in which Manipur had to face lots of atrocities. When the Burmese left, the king of Manipur had to bring in the British as the guarantor of security. And once the British enter the region, the scene, they mess everything up. So Manipur lost sovereignty. The British they forced the king of Manipur to have a British political officer in the court. And then they were forced to start bringing in these outsiders into Manipuri territory and settling there, who are the Cookies. But around 1900, less than 1% of the population of Manipur was Cookies. Today, Manipur is overwhelmed with Cookies. And even after 1947, after 1949, when Manipur becomes part of India, the Indian government continued the same British policies of bringing in foreigners, these Burmese origin, the people who are on the other side of the border into Manipur as refugees. I don't know for what reason. And what has now happened is that the southern portion of Manipur, more than 50% of the territory, is now under the control of these outsiders, these infiltrators. Okay? And over the past 10 years, thousands of new villages are visible in satellite images. And maybe 1 million or so people must have infiltrated into India from across the border. Now, is it the government's fault? No, it is the fault of previous governments who did not ever fence the border. And there was this open border regime that India and Burma had signed, that the border will remain open and people will have the right to move across the border for a certain amount of time and a certain amount of kilometers. So because of that, these people have been able to infiltrate close to 1 million people into India. And the native Manipuris, the people who speak the Manipuri language, which has been around for 2000 years and who have always ruled Manipur, they now occupy less than 7% of their ancestral territories. So that's the deal. That's what's happened in Manipur. The so-called Cookies, they have ethnically cleansed out the Nagas, the Meiteis of Manipur, and they are still pouring in across the border from Burma. The government of Burma has lost control. There is a civil war kind of situation. And there is the involvement of Western missionaries very strongly in the anti-Burmese government efforts. And there is the involvement of China as well. China also would like to take advantage of the situation. And who is suffering? The people of Burma are suffering, and the people of India, especially Manipur, are suffering. So what is the solution to this? The solution is very simple. All the outsiders, all the foreigners have to be sent back, repatriated, either to Burma or to Yunnan or wherever else, not in India. And the native Indians have to be given their lands back. But that is easier said than done. Because what about the records, the census records? Everybody has Aadhaar cards. Once you have an Aadhaar card, you have an election card. And these so-called Cookie people, they are classified as scheduled tribes. So they get preferential treatment. They become IAS officers, IFS officers. Not IFS, even IFS, I'm sure. So they get, and the native Meitei people of Manipur, they are general category. So what do they get? They get nothing. They don't get any good jobs or anything. These people get free, all kinds of benefits, reservation benefits, and they also get high-ranking positions in the government of India. So that is the situation right now, and it is all happening because of the instability in Burma across the border. Once again, there's the golden triangle angle, which is the drugs angle. Burma, Thailand, and Cambodia. These regions have historically been the golden triangle where all these narcotics come from, because poppy, opium, and various other plants are grown there, which are then processed and refined through chemical processes into heroin, cocaine, and whatnot. Mainly heroin and heroin derivative substances. And that has devastated the northeast of India in the 1970s and 80s also. And we are seeing, for some time, Manipur was doing well. And then this whole problem erupted in May last year. So it is not a law and order issue. It's a geopolitical issue. It is a continuation of efforts from outside of India, from the west of India, far west, let's say, to keep on applying the pain and pressure on India so that India doesn't have the chance to have, unbroken growth. There'll always be pressure points applied on India. That's the deal right now.
Because where there's chaos, there'll be economic fueling.
Yeah.
That's effectively the geopolitical logic, that money will be fueled in that direction. And therefore it affects the money that would have been reinvested in a nation's growth.
Yes, you could have had a growth over here. You could have economies and businesses and commercial activities that could have erupted, that could have grown very smoothly in the far east of India, in Manipur and other places. But now you have this strife. And all that money has to be used in just maintaining some kind of law and order. And there's daily terrorist attacks on civilians and on government forces. Just a couple of days ago, some CRPF people were killed by the outsiders, by the foreigners, refugees, so-called, and so on. So this is a situation that's going on. Eventually, it will take maybe 20, 30 years to have some kind of solution to this problem. It is not something we will be able to solve next week or next month or next year. It's a demographic issue. About 1 million outsiders have come and settled down and squatted in Indian territory because of the actions of the previous governments of the past 50, 70 years who kept the border open. Now we are going to fence the border. It's going to take at least 10 years. It is extremely wooded and hilly, this area. And then you'll have to man the border just the way we man the India-Pakistan border. It's going to take a long time to do this. By the time, I don't know how many more foreigners will infiltrate into India. Big problem for India.
Another use case for drones.
Maybe. But when you have thick forest cover, even drones may not be that useful. But yeah, some use for sure. Yeah, big problem right now. And no immediate solution.
Yeah. Again, I think the core aspects that we wanted to convey to the audience have now been conveyed. It's a bit of a geopolitical update. This year seems like it's going to be much more than what we call a flashpoint. So this is the stuff that's going on before things escalate, according to me. I don't know if that's a too cinematic a thing to say or not, but that's what I feel. Is there any signing off note you have from a geopolitical perspective?
Yeah, this is a pivotal year geopolitically. Elections in some of the most important nations in the world. The Indian general elections are going on right now as we speak. Sometime in June, we will know who's the next Prime Minister, whether Mr. Modi continues or whether there is some very unexpected change. So I will not tell the people whom to vote for, but there you have it. So there's India, and then there's the US elections, which are going to happen in November this year. And the results will be out pretty soon. So that's also a very important election. Russia already happened, Pakistan, the fake elections happened, and Mr. Sharif came to power, and Indonesia and so on. And the Maldives also happened, elections happened. And it was a landslide victory for Mr. Muizu, who is anti-India. So it's a pivotal year, a year of elections. Things could change globally. But yeah, the temperature geopolitically over time is rising. And that's not good for the stability of the world and for the economic order. But that's where we are. We are living in interesting times. And the Chinese have this saying, may you live in interesting times, as a curse. So maybe we are living in a cursed time.
AC, another great episode.
Thank you.
Probably our 25th or 30th episode by this point. So appreciate your presence always. Don't need to say that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. That was the episode for today, ladies and gentlemen. Right after the recording of this episode, we also did a history special with AC. That one was centered around Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan. I adore history episodes. I love doing geopolitics episodes, but history episodes are extremely special. So when it comes to AC, the one thing I'd like for you guys to tell us is what other aspects of history would you like to learn with the great man. Abhijit Chavda has completed yet another shoot with us. There's another episode that's coming your way. But for now, both AC and RA will be back on TRS very, very, very soon. Lots of love. Thank you for your support.